Hi everyone, and welcome to this drawing video. In this video I'll be showing you how to draw a mouse. In terms of the materials I'm using in this drawing, I'm using a mechanical pencil with HB leads on smooth Bristol board paper. I'm also using a blending stick to help with the smoothing of the shading, and I'm using a small eraser to add the highlights. But don't worry too much about the equipment you're using. As long as you have a pencil and paper in hand, you'll be able to create something like this. I started off by sketching the mouse's head, starting with an angled line going upwards for the front of the mouse's face, and then having, at the tip of the nose, having a line going downwards at almost a 90-degree angle, adding a little angled line to show the underside of the nose as well, and then adding another line further down to show the mouth. Moving along from the corner of the mouth and a little bit further towards the top of the head, that's where I added the eye. A mouse's eye is very large in proportion to its head, and I really wanted to focus on this area as a prominent part of the drawing. I really love focusing on the details of the eyes, and especially adding the highlights later on. Having them as a prominent feature is something I really love to do in my drawings. In line with the corner of the eye, I added the ear in the background, and then at a little bit of an angle I added the ear in the foreground. I don't like to have drawings from an exact side view. I prefer to have them at a bit more of an angled view to be a bit more of a natural pose. So having this ear in the foreground at a little bit of an angle to the ear in the background is a nice way to have a bit more of a dynamic shape to the drawing. After that, I sketched the rest of the outline of the mouse's back. It's important to note that the mouse's head is very large in comparison to its body overall, with the head almost taking up half of the body length. Moving on from sketching the mouse's back, it was then time to work on the mouse's belly and the legs, keeping that same idea of having a more dynamic pose, so having the leg in the background further forward than the leg in the foreground, and also focusing more details to the leg in the foreground as well. With the mouse's belly touching the ground, it meant that I didn't have to worry about adding the outlines of the back leg in the background. I just had to add the one in the foreground, which is nice because it means that it cuts down on the amount of details we have to add later on in the shading. And then I added the outlines of the mouse's tail. And as a final part of this sketch, I added the outlines of the highlights that I wanted to add in the mouse's eye, and I added some outlines of where I wanted some of the fur placement around the mouse's head. With the outlines drawn, it was time to move on to the shading, and I wanted to start off by adding the shading to the mouse's head. I started by adding some fur to the end of the mouse's nose. My method for adding fur or hair to an animal drawing like this is to start off by adding some quick fine strokes with the pencil, and then using the blending stick to smooth out the shading, and then using the eraser to add some layered lines over the top of that, and just building up a layered effect. That's what I've been using for a lot of my animal drawings recently, and it's a process that I really enjoy using. It's also important to note that when you're working on a drawing of fur or hair, don't worry too much about the placement of each individual hair or anything like that. It's important not to overthink those details, because if you think about it, hair or fur are always moving and changing, and so copying a reference exactly wouldn't really help you at all, and it would make the drawing seem kind of awkward because you're thinking too much about the line placement. So just use quick fine strokes in a drawing like this and the outcome will be a lot better. For the shading of the mouse's eye, I made sure to leave those highlighted blocks at the top of the eye. I added some darker shading to the top half of the eye and then added some medium shading to the lower half of the eye, almost to show kind of a reflection of the surface that the mouse is standing on. I also added some darker outlines going around the outside of the eye, making sure to leave some highlighted areas to show the eyelids and some of the details in the corner of the eye. I continued the same process for adding the fur around the mouse's head, making sure to add some lighter hair to the details around the mouse's mouth. For this I actually used a lot of the eraser to just take away some of the details and just lighten up the fur around that area. I wanted to keep that area nice and light to go along with the references that I saw in front of me. So in this example I'm focusing most of the details of the mouse's face to the eye. After that, I started adding shading to the mouse's ears, starting with the ear in the background, adding a medium level of shading, and then adding some darker fur going along the top edge of the ear. For the ear in the foreground, I started by adding some darker fur going around the top edge, and then added some medium shading in the center of the ear, focusing on the shapes within the ear. There's some kind of ridges in the center part of the ear, so I used the blending stick to help control the shading within that area. And once I was happy with the level of shading within the ear, I then used the small eraser to add some layers of fur going over the top and overlapping all of that shading within the ear. This is a great way to add some realism to the drawing, and it also gives a really nice 3D effect. After that, with the details of the mouse's head shaded, it was time to move on to adding the shading to the rest of the mouse's body. And when it came to adding the shading to the mouse's front feet, I focused most of the detail to the foot in the foreground, making the foot in the background almost seem kind of blurred, just to push it further into the background, adding a mid-level of shading and a little bit of darker shading to the underside of it, but then focusing more detail to the foot in the foreground, just sharpening up the outlines and adding some fur over the top of the foot. When it came to adding the fur to the rest of the mouse's body, I used the same process, but I used longer strokes with the pencil. But still using the same process by adding the quick strokes first, and then using the blending stick, and then using a small eraser to add some different layers of fur over the top of it, and in some cases using that process again over the top of it. I then added some medium shading to the underside of the mouse's back foot, and then used the fur process to add some shorter fur going along the top edge of the foot. But a great thing about this drawing is that I didn't have to worry too much about adding the details to the feet overall, because once I'd added some shading to them, I then used the small eraser to add some fur overlapping those areas. This added to the realism of the drawing, and in effect it meant that I didn't have to worry too much about the details added to those areas. The final part of the mouse to add shading to was the tail. So I started by adding the skin texture that goes underneath, which is kind of a ringed texture that goes all the way down towards the tip of the tail. And then I used the fur process, but adding a really short length of fur going all the way down the tail. As a final touch to this drawing, I added a shadow underneath the mouse just to help add to that 3D effect of this drawing. Just to help the realism overall, adding the darkest part of the shading to the underside of the belly that is closest to the surface that it's standing on. After that, this drawing was completed. Overall, I think it only took about 2 hours in total to complete. It was actually really fun to work on, and if you do work on it, then feel free to show me your work on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. I really look forward to seeing your work on there. I really hope this video helped out in some way, and please be sure to let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoy videos like this, then make sure you're subscribed, and any likes, shares, that kind of support is always hugely appreciated, and it really means so much to me. If you want to follow me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram and follow along with the progress photos throughout the week, then be sure to check out the links in the description box below. And once again, thank you so much for the support on this channel. I really hope this video helps out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all soon.